Power has a funny way of blinding those who hold it, convincing them they are untouchable right up until the floor drops out from under their feet. Officer Braden Holt thought he owned the municipal courtroom, the precinct, and the city streets, when he maliciously kicked a quiet black woman sitting in the gallery simply because she didn't move fast enough for his liking. He expected her to cower. He expected fear. Instead, she just looked at his badge. He had no idea he had just assaulted the incoming chief of police, and his brutal downfall was already in motion. Officer Braden Holt adjusted his utility belt, letting the heavy brass buckle clink against the wooden railing of the witness stand in Municipal Courtroom 4B. He was a veteran of the force, a man whose career was paved with dismissed excessive force complaints and union grievances. Statistically, Holt was a walking liability. He belonged to the mere 4% of patrolmen nationwide who are responsible for over 50% of all civilian use of force complaints within a given department. Yet in his mind, he was the thin blue line incarnate. The complaints were just the cost of doing business, the whining of a public that didn't understand what it took to keep the streets clean. Today's docket was a standard affair. He had just finished testifying against a young man he had arrested for disorderly conduct, a charge that in truth stemmed from the young man simply questioning why Holt had detained him in the first place. Judge Victor Thorpe, a tired man peering over half-moon spectacles, had nodded along with Holt's rehearsed testimony. Too exhausted by the overloaded municipal system to dig into the inconsistencies of the police report, as Thorpe stamped the file and dismissed the witness, Holt stepped down from the stand with a heavy, arrogant swagger. He felt invincible. He smirked at the defense attorney, Nolan Graves, and began his walk down the center aisle of the gallery. The courtroom was mostly empty, save for a few civilians waiting for traffic appeals and minor misdemeanors. Sitting in the second row, right on the edge of the narrow aisle, was a woman. She was a sharply dressed black woman in her late 40s, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, professional bun, and she was intently reading a thick, leather-bound folder on her lap. She wasn't there for a ticket. She wasn't on the docket. She was simply observing. As Holt marched down the aisle, his broad shoulders squared, he expected the seas to part. It was a habit born of years of unchecked authority. Civilians moved for him. That was the rule. But the woman, engrossed in her reading, didn't notice his rapid approach. Her knee was turned slightly outward, her sleek black heel resting an inch into the walkway. Holt didn't pause. He didn't say, "Excuse me." Instead, a surge of irrational, bubbling irritation flared in his chest. How dare someone not immediately yield to his uniform? He purposely altered his trajectory just a fraction, bringing his heavy, steel-toed tactical boot directly into the woman's shin. He kicked her hard. It wasn't a bump. It wasn't an accident. It was a sharp, vicious strike meant to cause pain and assert dominance. The heavy toe of his boot connected with her leg and the wooden leg of the bench simultaneously, producing a loud thwack that echoed in the quiet room. The woman gasped, her head snapping up, her hand instinctively dropping to her bruised shin. The heavy leather folder slid from her lap, spilling a few papers onto the linoleum floor. Holt stopped, towering over her. He didn't apologize. Instead, his face contorted into a sneer. "Watch where you're putting your legs," he growled, his voice a low, hostile rumble. Then, leaning in just close enough that only she could hear, he muttered a vile, racially charged slur under his breath, tying it neatly with a command to know your place. The woman froze. The pain in her leg was evident, but her expression rapidly shifted from shock to a chilling, absolute stillness. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't scramble to pick up her papers. She slowly looked up from her leg, tracing the line of Holt's uniform, past his duty belt, past his radio, landing squarely on the silver shield pinned to his chest. Her dark eyes locked onto his badge number. She stared at it for 3 long, agonizing seconds, burning the numerals into her memory. Holt, unnerved by her lack of submission, decided to double down. If she wasn't going to cower, he would force her out. "Bailiff Ellis!" Holt barked, turning toward the front of the room. Ellis, an older bailiff who had been half asleep by the door, jolted upright. "Yeah, Braden, what is it?" "This woman is causing a disturbance. She's blocking the aisle and refusing to comply with a court officer. Get her out of here," Holt demanded, jabbing a thick finger in the woman's direction. Judge Thorpe looked up from his paperwork, annoyed by the sudden noise. "What's the issue, officer?" "Just a disruptive civilian, Your Honor. I'm having Ellis clear her out so we can maintain order." Thorpe waved a dismissive hand. "Just keep it quiet. Next case." Ellis hurried over, looking apologetic but unwilling to cross a veteran patrolman. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the courtroom." The woman didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She calmly bent down, gathered her spilled papers, and placed them back into her leather folder. She stood up, smoothing the front of her navy blazer. She looked at Holt one last time. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the clinical, detached look of a surgeon examining a tumor right before excising it. Without a single word, she turned and walked out the heavy oak doors. The heavy oak doors of Municipal Courtroom 4B swung shut with a soft click, leaving Braden Holt standing in the aisle with a self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that accompanied a successful display of dominance. To him, the interaction was already fading into the background hum of his day. Just another civilian put in their place. Another minor victory in his ongoing war against anyone who didn't show absolute deference to the badge. He pushed through the swinging doors a moment later, stepping out into the bustling courthouse corridor. He expected to see the woman lingering, perhaps crying or complaining to a clerk, but the hallway was empty of the navy blazer. She had vanished like a ghost. "Good riddance," Holt muttered to himself, adjusting his collar. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the 12th precinct was thick with the smell of stale coffee, sweat, and cheap floor wax. The precinct was a boys' club, a relic of an older era of policing that had somehow survived the modern push for reform. Holt felt right at home here. He sat at his cluttered desk, tossing a crumpled paper cup into the trash can. Across the room, Officer Sean O'Connor and Sergeant Paul Mitchell were laughing over a video on someone's phone. Holt strolled over, leaning heavily against the partition. "You boys look entirely too happy for a weekday," Holt drawled. O'Connor, a younger cop who practically worshipped the ground Holt walked on, grinned. "Just looking at the retirement countdown for the old man." The old man was Chief Frank Sullivan, a figurehead who had spent the last several years asleep at the wheel, allowing officers like Holt to run roughshod over the city's lower-income neighborhoods. Sullivan's impending retirement was the talk of the department. "Good," Holt said, crossing his arms. "Maybe now we can get some real leadership. Word on the street is they're looking at Captain Hughes from narcotics. If Hughes gets the nod, I'm next in line for a bump to sergeant. I've put in my time. I've bled for this city." Mitchell chuckled, rubbing his stubbled jaw. "You sure you haven't just made other people bleed, Braden? Internal Affairs has a file on you thicker than the phone book." "Kiss my ass," Holt scoffed, puffing out his chest. "I get results. Just today, I had to toss some entitled woman out of Thorpe's courtroom. Thought she owned the place, sticking her legs out in the aisle, trying to trip me up. I gave her a little love tap with the boot and had Ellis throw her out on the street." "You kicked a woman in open court?" O'Connor asked, his eyebrows rising slightly, though a smirk played on his lips. She was in the way, Holt said, his tone turning cold. She needed to learn respect. People these days, especially, well, you know, they think the uniform is a suggestion. I reminded her it's a mandate. He left out the slur. He left out the malice. He painted himself as the stern enforcer of public order. In the echo chamber of the 12th precinct, his version of events became the absolute truth. As the week dragged on, the precinct buzzed with anticipation. The mayor's office had been unusually tight-lipped about Sullivan's replacement. Usually the rumor mill had the new chief pegged weeks in advance, the promotion a result of backroom handshakes and political favors. But this time, the mayor had instituted a total blackout on information. Holt spent his weekend playing golf, drinking imported beer, and bragging to anyone who would listen about his impending promotion. He felt the universe was finally aligning in his favor. He had seniority. He had the backing of the union reps, and he was confident that whoever took the top spot would recognize his value. He didn't know that miles away in a high-rise office overlooking the city skyline, the woman from the courtroom was sitting across from Mayor Kenneth Hughes. Kendra Voss was not a civilian. She was a highly decorated former deputy commissioner from a major out-of-state metropolitan department, brought in secretly by the mayor to gut the systemic corruption within the city's police force. On her desk sat a thick, freshly printed dossier. The name on the tab read, Holt, Braden, badge number 8842. You're sure about starting with him? Mayor Hughes asked, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The union will throw a fit. He's got friends in ugly places. Kendra Voss didn't smile. She ran her finger over the bruised, swollen discoloration on her shin, hidden beneath her slacks. Mayor, your department has paid out millions in civil rights settlements in recent years, Voss said, her voice smooth, measured, and dangerously calm. Officers like Holt don't just cost you money. They cost you the trust of the people you govern. He operates under the assumption of impunity. I don't just want him gone. I want him to serve as a very public, very permanent example. She closed the dossier with a sharp snap. I'm sure, she said softly. Monday morning arrived with a biting chill that cut through the city's damp air. The atmosphere inside the 12th precinct's main roll call room was electric. The room was packed to capacity, standing room only. Patrolmen, detectives, sergeants, and lieutenants were crammed shoulder to shoulder, their breath creating a faint haze in the poorly ventilated space. Every officer had been ordered to attend this mandatory all-hands briefing. It was the official swearing in and introduction of the new chief of police. Braden Holt sat in the front row, his legs splayed out in a relaxed, wide stance. His boots, the same boots he had worn in court, rested heavily on the scuffed linoleum. He was sipping a coffee, leaning over occasionally to whisper a joke to Sean O'Connor, who sat to his right. Holt was utterly unbothered. He was ready to clap for whatever internal crony had won the political lottery, and then get back to the streets. At the appointed hour, the side door of the briefing room opened. The low hum of 100 overlapping conversations instantly died. The silence that swept over the room was absolute, heavy, and expectant. Mayor Kenneth Hughes walked in first, flanked by two members of his security detail. The mayor looked unusually stern. He didn't offer his usual politician's wave or easy smile. He walked directly to the wooden podium at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone. Good morning, the mayor said, his voice echoing slightly through the PA system. As you all know, Chief Sullivan officially retired. I want to thank him for his years of service. However, as we look to the future, it has become abundantly clear that this city requires a fundamental shift in its approach to law enforcement. Holt rolled his eyes invisibly. Politicians speak, he thought. Just give us the name so we can go. We have a crisis of trust, the mayor continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, intentionally avoiding the front row. We have a culture that has, in some sectors, become toxic. We need a reformer. We need an outsider. We need someone who does not owe any favors to anyone in this room. A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the back rows of the room. An outsider? That was unprecedented. The union had practically demanded an internal hire. Holt frowned, shifting his weight in his plastic chair. The relaxed posture vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping tension. Therefore, the mayor said, raising his voice slightly to cut through the murmurs, I have bypassed the traditional internal candidate list. I sought out one of the most decorated, uncompromising, and effective law enforcement executives in the country. She has a mandate to clean house, to rebuild community trust, and to hold every single officer accountable to the oath they swore. Holt's stomach gave a strange, involuntary twitch. It is my distinct honor, the mayor said, stepping back from the podium and gesturing to the side door, to introduce your new chief of police, Chief Kendra Voss. The side door opened wider. The sound of sharp, rhythmic footsteps echoed against the tile floor. First came the polished black dress shoes, then the razor-sharp creases of navy blue uniform trousers, then the crisp white shirt, the solid gold badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and finally the 4 gold stars resting heavy on the collar. Chief Kendra Voss stepped out from the shadows and into the center of the room. She stood tall, her posture immaculate. Her hair was pulled back into the exact same neat, professional bun she had worn days prior. Her face was set in a mask of absolute, unyielding authority. The breath left Braden Holt's lungs in a single, violent rush. The coffee cup in his hand trembled, his eyes widened, pupils dilating in pure, unadulterated shock. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. It was her, the woman from the courtroom, the woman whose shin he had kicked, the woman he had cursed at, the woman he had ordered the bailiff to throw out into the street. She wasn't a civilian. She was the absolute highest authority in his professional universe. Holt couldn't move. He couldn't swallow. His brain scrambled desperately, trying to find a way out, trying to convince him that this was a case of mistaken identity, a look-alike, a nightmare. But as he stared at her face, he remembered the cold, calculating way her dark eyes had locked onto his badge number. She hadn't been cowering in fear. She had been taking inventory. Chief Voss stepped up to the podium. The room was so silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't look at the mayor. She looked directly down at the front row. Her eyes found Braden Holt. The gaze she leveled at him was not angry. It was far worse than anger. It was the look of an apex predator looking at a trapped, bleeding animal. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. The rest of the officers in the room began to follow her line of sight, turning their heads to look at Holt, who was now visibly sweating, his complexion the color of ash. Finally, Chief Voss leaned into the microphone. "Officers," she said, her voice smooth, measured, and holding the unmistakable ring of absolute power. "We have a lot of work to do, and it starts immediately." She paused, keeping her eyes deadlocked on Holt's terrified face. "Officer Braden Holt, badge number 8842, she stated, her voice slicing through the silent room like a scalpel. "Stand up." The plastic chair groaned as Officer Braden Holt forced his legs to push him upward. The movement was incredibly slow, almost robotic, as if gravity in the room had suddenly multiplied. His knees felt like water. The swagger that had defined his career evaporated in a matter of seconds, replaced by a cold, primal terror that gripped his throat. Around him, The 12th precinct roll call room was entombed in an agonizing silence. 200 of his peers, superiors, and subordinates watched him stand. Sean O'Connor, the young officer who usually shadowed him like an eager puppy, instinctively leaned away, putting physical distance between himself and a man who was clearly about to be decimated. Chief Kendra Voss did not blink. She watched him rise with the detached, analytical gaze of a coroner determining a time of death. "Officer Holt," Chief Voss began, her voice echoing through the PA system. She didn't yell. The terrifying part was how calm, how incredibly steady her voice remained. "On that afternoon, you provided testimony in Municipal Courtroom 4B before Judge Victor Thorpe. Do you recall this?" Holt opened his mouth, but his throat was completely dry. His tongue felt like sandpaper. He managed a weak, pathetic nod, verbal confirmation. "Officer?" she commanded, the steel in her tone flashing briefly. "Yes," Holt croaked. "Yes, Chief." "Following your testimony," Voss continued, her eyes sweeping the room before locking back onto his pale, sweating face, "you exited the witness stand. As you walked down the center aisle, you encountered a civilian seated in the gallery. She was not on your docket. She had not spoken to you. She was merely reading a file." The room held its collective breath. Sergeant Paul Mitchell, sitting 3 rows back, swallowed hard, suddenly remembering the boastful, arrogant story Holt had told him by the coffee machine days prior. Instead of asking this civilian to adjust her posture, or simply stepping around her as the 4 feet of available aisle space allowed, you chose a different course of action, Voss said. She stepped out from behind the wooden podium, standing directly in front of the front row. "You altered your path. You intentionally brought the steel toe of your tactical boot into the civilian's shin." A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the back of the room. A veteran cop assaulting a random civilian in open court was bad enough, but the growing realization dawning on every officer in the room that the civilian was the very woman standing before them, with 4 gold stars on her collar, was a localized apocalypse. "You then proceeded to loom over this woman," Voss stated, her voice dropping an octave, "and instructed her to watch where she was putting her legs. You then muttered a racially charged slur and ordered her to know her place. Finally, you ordered Bailiff Ellis to forcefully eject her from a public courtroom, falsely claiming she was causing a disturbance." Holt felt the blood rushing in his ears. The room began to spin slightly. He looked to the mayor, hoping for some political intervention. But Mayor Kenneth Hughes was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, utterly refusing to make eye contact. "Officer Holt," Voss said, taking 1 step closer so she was mere feet away from him. "Do you know whose place you told to know her place?" He couldn't answer. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his Kevlar vest. "You told the incoming chief of police to know her place," Voss answered for him. The absolute finality of her words crashed down on him like a physical blow. "And my place, Officer Holt, is right here, cleaning up the rot that officers like you have allowed to fester in this department." Suddenly, a voice piped up from the middle aisle. It was Curtis Hammond, the senior union representative for the local Fraternal Order of Police. He stood up, trying to project authority, though his voice wavered slightly. "Chief Voss, with all due respect," Hammond interjected, holding up a hand, "union bylaws dictate that any disciplinary action or accusation of misconduct must be handled behind closed doors with union representation present. You cannot publicly interrogate an officer in a roll call setting. This violates Article 15 of his collective bargaining agreement." Chief Voss slowly turned her head to look at Curtis Hammond. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Mr. Hammond?" Voss said smoothly, having clearly anticipated the interruption. "I am intimately familiar with your collective bargaining agreement. I am also intimately familiar with State Penal Code Section 149, Assault under Color of Authority, and Title 18, USC, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. I am not interrogating Officer Holt. I am not asking him questions for an administrative review. I am informing him of a change in his employment status based on an event I personally witnessed and was the victim of. Hammond opened his mouth to argue, but Voss cut him off with a sharp, decisive slice of her hand through the air. Officer Holt is a walking liability who has cost the taxpayers of this city millions of dollars in excessive force settlements. He has operated with absolute impunity because this department allowed a culture of silence to protect him, Voss declared, her voice ringing off the concrete walls. That culture died the moment I walked through that door. She turned back to the trembling man in the front row. Officer Braden Holt, step forward. He didn't want to. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to argue, to fight, but the sheer gravitational pull of her authority compelled him forward. He stepped out of the row, standing entirely exposed in the front of the room. Remove your duty weapon and hand it to Sergeant O'Reilly, Voss ordered, gesturing to the heavily armed internal affairs sergeant standing by the side door. Holt's hands shook violently as he unclasped his holster. He pulled the heavy Glock from its resting place, his knuckles white, and handed it over. Now your badge. This was the killing blow. The badge was his identity. It was his shield, his sword, his entire sense of self-worth. To take it in front of the entire precinct was a public execution of his career. He fumbled with the pin on his chest, his fingers clumsy and numb. It took him 3 agonizing tries to unhook it. He handed the silver shield to Chief Voss. She took it without touching his hands, dropping it into her blazer pocket. You are hereby stripped of all police powers, Voss announced, projecting her voice so every single person in the room heard the death knell of his career. You are suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation that I will be personally overseeing alongside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. Turn in your radio, your ID card, and your keys to the desk, Sergeant. Then get off my property. She didn't wait for him to respond. She turned her back on him and walked back to the podium. Now, Chief Voss said, looking out at the remaining sea of stunned, wide-eyed officers. Let's talk about the new standards of this department. Holt stood there for a terrible, agonizing moment, completely ignored, entirely powerless. He was a ghost. He turned and walked down the center aisle toward the back exit. Not a single officer met his eye. Not Sean O'Connor, not Paul Mitchell. They all stared straight ahead, terrified of catching the new chief's attention. The brotherhood he had so arrogantly relied upon had vanished like smoke. The walk of shame from the precinct to his civilian car felt like a forced march through purgatory. Braden Holt carried a small cardboard box containing a few personal items, a coffee mug, some pens, a framed photo of a fishing trip. He threw the box into the passenger seat of his pickup truck, slammed the door, and gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. He tried to convince himself he could fight this. He was a veteran. The Union would back him. They always backed him. Hammond had tried to speak up, right? That meant they were in his corner. But as the days dragged on into a brutally cold season, the reality of his situation set in with terrifying speed. His first move was to call his supposed brothers in blue. He sat in his dark apartment, a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand, and dialed Sean O'Connor. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He dialed Paul Mitchell. User busy. He tried 3 other guys from his shift. Nothing. Radio silence. The message was crystal clear. Holt was toxic waste, and getting too close to him meant catching the radioactive fallout of the new chief's wrath. The financial hit was immediate and devastating. Suspended without pay meant his bi-weekly direct deposit vanished. Holt lived beyond his means. A hefty truck payment, a nice apartment in a gentrified neighborhood, expensive bar tabs. Within weeks, the panic began to set in as his savings account hemorrhaged cash. Then came the meeting with the union. Holt drove to the local FOP lodge, expecting a war room full of lawyers ready to file grievances against Chief Voss for his public humiliation. Instead, he was ushered into a small, sterile conference room where Curtis Hammond sat alone, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "All right, Curtis, what's the strategy?" Holt demanded, dropping into a chair. "We going after her for violating Article 15, hostile work environment?" Curtis sighed, folding his hands on the table. He didn't look Holt in the eye. Braden, the Union Legal Defense Fund Board met, and they voted unanimously to deny your request for legal representation. Holt stared at him, uncomprehending. "What the hell are you talking about? I pay my dues. I've paid into that fund for years." "You have," Hammond agreed softly. "But the bylaws are very specific, Braden. The fund covers officers for actions taken within the scope of their official duties. Kicking a civilian in the shin in an aisle because she was in your way and following it up with a racial slur, the board determined that falls outside the scope of your duties. It's classified as a malicious, off-duty style assault, even if you were in uniform." "She's lying about the slur," Holt yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "It's her word against mine." Hammond slowly opened a manila folder on the table and slid a shiny USB drive across the laminate surface. "It's not her word against yours, Braden," Hammond said grimly. "That's the discovery packet Internal Affairs just sent over to the district attorney. You didn't do your homework. The city used a federal grant to upgrade the municipal courthouse's accessibility features. They installed high-definition parabolic microphones at the judge's bench, the witness stand, and the bailiff station to assist the hearing impaired. The bottom fell out of Holt's stomach. The room seemed to tilt. "The microphone at the bailiff station picked up everything," Hammond continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "It picked up the kick, it picked up your threat, and it picked up the slur. Clear as day. The audio has already been authenticated. The FBI has a copy. The DA has a copy. You are entirely indefensible, Braden. The union cannot attach its name to this. You're on your own. You need to hire a private defense attorney, and you need to do it today." Holt left the lodge in a daze. Private defense attorneys for federal civil rights charges required retainers starting at tens of thousands of dollars, money he absolutely did not have. The karma, however, was not finished without him. Chief Voss was a master tactician, and her cleanup of the 12th precinct extended far beyond simply firing a bad cop. She knew that to truly break the cycle, the financial consequences had to fall on the perpetrator, not just the city. Days later, a sharp knock echoed on Holt's apartment door. He opened it to find a process server who cheerfully handed him a thick stack of legal documents. Holt tore open the envelope. It was a civil lawsuit. The plaintiff was Trevor Caldwell, the young man Holt had falsely arrested for disorderly conduct, the very case he had been testifying in on the day he kicked Chief Voss. With the chief of police publicly stating that Holt was a corrupt officer prone to malicious actions, the floodgates had opened. Civil rights attorneys were circling Holt's past arrests like sharks smelling blood in the water. Trevor Caldwell's attorney was suing the city, but crucially, he was also suing Braden Holt personally in his individual capacity, stripping away his qualified immunity because the assault in the courtroom proved a pattern of malicious racial bias. His life rapidly disintegrated. By the following month, the district attorney, feeling the intense political pressure from Mayor Hughes and the terrifyingly competent Chief Voss, filed formal criminal charges: aggravated assault and official oppression. The FBI followed suit a week later with federal civil rights violations. He was forced to sell his truck to pay a second-rate lawyer who advised him to take a plea deal. He moved out of his luxury apartment and into a cramped, dingy motel on the outskirts of the city, eating canned soup and watching his face splashed across the evening news. He was the poster boy for police corruption, the ultimate villain in Chief Voss's highly successful reform campaign. One rainy day, exactly months after the courtroom incident, Holt found himself sitting in a different courtroom. He wasn't wearing his crisp blue uniform, his polished boots, or his badge. He was wearing an ill-fitting gray suit he had bought at a thrift store. He was sitting at the defense table. As he waited for the judge to enter, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Holt turned his head, his heart pounding in his chest. Walking down the center aisle, her posture immaculate, was Chief Kendra Voss. She was wearing her formal dress uniform, the 4 gold stars gleaming under the warm courtroom lights. She didn't swagger. She didn't demand people move. She walked with the quiet, devastating grace of absolute authority. She took a seat in the second row of the gallery, right on the edge of the narrow aisle. She crossed her legs neatly, resting a thick, leather-bound folder on her lap. She looked at Holt. She didn't smile. She didn't sneer. She simply offered him that same clinical, detached look of a surgeon observing a tumor that had finally been successfully excised. Holt turned away, his hands trembling as he stared down at the scuffed wooden table. He had demanded that she know her place. Now, utterly broken, bankrupt, and facing years in a federal penitentiary, Braden Holt finally knew his. Federal courtrooms possess a distinct, suffocating gravity that municipal courts simply lack. There is no chaotic shuffling of minor traffic offenders, no bored clerks stamping endless stacks of paper. The United States District Court was a temple of absolute consequence, all polished mahogany, acoustic paneling, and a silence so profound it felt heavy on the shoulders. Sitting at the defense table, Braden Holt felt that weight pressing him down into the leather chair. His thrift store suit was already clinging to his back with nervous sweat. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of the man who had swaggered through the 12th precinct months prior. The aggressive, dominant patrolman was gone, replaced by a trembling, cornered animal. His attorney, a worn-down public defender named Mitchell Ford, was frantically organizing a meager stack of legal pads. Ford was a good man, but he was hopelessly outgunned. Sitting at the prosecution table was Stephen Corcoran, a sharp, impeccably dressed attorney from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Corcoran moved with the predatory confidence of a man who knew he possessed an unbeatable hand. The trial for the federal civil rights violations and aggravated assault had moved with terrifying speed. Chief Kendra Voss had ensured there were no administrative delays, no blue wall tactics to stall the proceedings. The evidence was simply too clean. The prosecution calls Officer Sean O'Connor to the stand, Corcoran announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous room. Holt's head snapped up, his breath caught in his throat. Sean. He watched in disbelief as his former protege, the young cop who used to laugh at his crude jokes and fetch his coffee, walked through the side doors. O'Connor wasn't wearing his uniform. He wore a muted charcoal suit. He looked pale, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor as he approached the witness box, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. This was the twist Holt hadn't seen coming. He knew O'Connor had distanced himself, but testifying for the federal government, that was the ultimate betrayal of the badge. Corcoran approached the podium, resting his hands on the edges. Mr. O'Connor, you were a patrol officer at the 12th precinct under the direct mentorship of the defendant, Braden Holt, correct? Yes, sir, O'Connor replied, his voice barely a whisper. He leaned into the microphone. Yes. And on that afternoon, did you have a conversation with the defendant regarding an incident that took place in Municipal Courtroom 4B? O'Connor finally flicked his eyes toward the defense table. The look he gave Holt wasn't apologetic. It was the desperate look of a man trying to save himself from a sinking ship. The FBI had leaned hard on the precinct, threatening accessory and obstruction charges for anyone who helped cover up the toxic culture Voss was actively dismantling. "I did," O'Connor said, swallowing hard. "He came up to me and Sergeant Mitchell near the desks. What did the defendant tell you, under oath, in your own words?" "He said he tossed an entitled woman out of court," O'Connor recited, his voice shaking slightly. "He said she was in his way, so he gave her a love tap with his boot. He bragged about it. He said she needed to learn respect." "Did he express any remorse? Did he claim it was an accident?" Corcoran pressed. "No," O'Connor said flatly. "He thought it was funny. He said people needed to know that the uniform isn't a suggestion. It's a mandate." Holt gripped the edge of the table so hard his fingernails dug into the wood. The betrayal sliced through him hotter than the impending prison sentence. The brotherhood he had championed, the loyalty he thought insulated him from the rules, was an illusion. It was a house of cards held together by intimidation. And the moment a stronger wind blew through in the form of Chief Voss and the FBI, it collapsed instantly. Ford attempted a cross-examination, trying to paint O'Connor as a young, confused officer coerced by federal agents, but the damage was irreversible. Corcoran didn't even bother to redirect. He had what he needed. The prosecution calls Chief Kendra Voss. The murmurs in the gallery died instantly as the heavy oak doors opened. Chief Voss walked down the aisle with the same measured, immaculate grace she possessed on the day she fired him. She wore her dress uniform, the 4 gold stars reflecting the courtroom lights. She took the stand, swearing the oath with a crisp, unwavering voice. Corcoran approached her with a distinct air of professional reverence. "Chief Voss, can you detail the events of that day from your perspective?" For the next minutes, Voss delivered a masterclass in testimony. She didn't sound like a victim. She sounded like an expert witness diagnosing a critical systemic failure. She recounted the kick with clinical precision, describing the force, the angle, and the immediate agonizing pain. Then Corcoran queued up the audio. The prosecution had obtained the parabolic microphone recordings from the courthouse. "Let's listen to Exhibit C," Corcoran said, pressing a button on his laptop. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. First came the ambient noise of the courtroom, the rustle of papers. Then the heavy, rhythmic thud of Holt's boots marching down the aisle. Then the sickening thwack of steel connecting with bone and wood. A collective flinch rippled through the jury box. Even Judge Albert Rosen, a hardened federal jurist with decades on the bench, frowned deeply at the violent sound. Over the speakers, Holt's voice echoed, dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "Watch where you're putting your legs." Then came the slur. It was low, guttural, and unmistakable. It was followed by the command to know your place. Holt closed his eyes, physically shrinking into his chair, hearing it played back, stripped of the adrenaline and the protective walls of the precinct. It sounded exactly like what it was, the action of a violent, bigoted thug hiding behind a piece of tin. "Chief Voss?" Corcoran said gently, shutting off the audio. "As a veteran law enforcement officer with decades of experience, how would you classify that interaction?" Voss looked directly at the jury. It was not a policing action. It was not crowd control. It was an unprovoked, malicious, and racially motivated battery perpetrated by a man who believed his badge was a license to inflict pain on civilians he deemed beneath him. She turned her gaze slowly toward the defense table, locking eyes with Holt. "It was the exact brand of corruption that destroys public trust, and it is the exact reason I came to this city, to remove him from his position." Ford declined to cross-examine her. There was nothing to ask. Attempting to rattle a seasoned police chief on the stand was tantamount to legal suicide, especially when the audio recording served as an ironclad corroboration of every word she spoke. The trial wrapped up faster than anyone anticipated. The prosecution rested. The defense, lacking any credible witnesses and blocked from using Holt's past commendations due to his horrific internal affairs file, rested shortly after. Closing arguments were a formality. Corcoran painted a vivid picture of a man drunk on power, a statistical anomaly of violence that the city had ignored for too long. He reminded the jury that the badge is a symbol of public trust, not a weapon of personal prejudice. Ford made a weak, half-hearted plea about the stresses of police work and the dangers of a split-second mistake, but the jury wasn't looking at him. They were staring at Holt with open disgust. Judge Rosen handed the jury their instructions, and they filed out of the courtroom. Holt sat in the holding cell behind the courtroom, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The concrete walls were freezing. The bravado, the anger, the entitlement, it had all burned away, leaving nothing but a hollow, gnawing terror. He realized with crushing clarity that he was no longer the apex predator of the city streets. He was the prey caught in a trap entirely of his own making. The deliberation was brutally swift. Exactly hours later, the bailiff summoned them back. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Rosen asked, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson, a middle-aged teacher, replied, standing up and passing a folded slip of paper to the clerk. The clerk handed it to the judge, who read it with a blank expression before handing it back. "On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law," the clerk read aloud, her voice ringing clear, "we find the defendant Braden Holt guilty." Holt's breath hitched. "On the count of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of official oppression, we find the defendant guilty." Ford placed a hand on Holt's shoulder, a hollow gesture of comfort. Holt didn't feel it. He was completely numb. Judge Rosen leaned forward over the heavy wooden bench, his eyes boring holes into the convicted man. "Mr. Holt, standard procedure might dictate I delay sentencing for a pre-sentence report. However, given the overwhelming nature of the evidence, the audio recordings, and the absolute lack of remorse demonstrated throughout this process, I see no reason to delay justice. Please stand." Holt forced himself to stand. His legs were shaking so violently he had to lean against the table to keep from collapsing. "For years, you wore a uniform that demands the highest level of integrity, and for years, you treated it as a shield to terrorize the public you swore to protect," Judge Rosen said, his voice laced with righteous contempt. "You assaulted a citizen in a court of law, a place meant to be the ultimate sanctuary of justice. You did it out of sheer, unadulterated arrogance. You told Chief Voss to know her place. I am now going to show you yours." The judge adjusted his glasses. "I sentence you to years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, upon your release, you will be subject to years of supervised probation, and you are permanently barred from ever holding a position in law enforcement, private security, or any municipal office for the remainder of your natural life." Holt gasped, a pathetic, strangled sound escaping his throat. Federal time meant exactly that. There was no early parole for good behavior. "Remand the prisoner to the custody of the United States Marshals," Judge Rosen ordered, striking the gavel with a sharp, echoing crack. Two heavy-set U.S. Marshals stepped up behind Holt. "Hands behind your back," one of them ordered gruffly. Holt complied, his arms moving sluggishly. He felt the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs bite into his wrists. The rhythmic clicking of the ratchets tightening was the loudest sound in the world. It was a sound he had subjected hundreds of people to, but feeling it on his own skin sent a jolt of sheer panic through his nervous system. As they turned him around to lead him down the center aisle, the exact same aisle where he had committed the assault, His eyes met the gallery. Chief Kendra Voss was standing. She wasn't gloating. She simply watched him with that same calm, unyielding expression. The cancer had been cut out. The karma didn't stop at the prison gates. While Holt sat in a cramped concrete cell in a federal facility, the real-world consequences of his actions continued to dismantle the life he left behind. The civil lawsuit filed by Trevor Caldwell, bolstered by Holt's federal conviction and Chief Voss's internal housecleaning, was resolved swiftly. The city settled for a substantial sum, but the individual liability against Holt remained. The civil court stripped him of his remaining assets. His pension, normally protected, was heavily garnished to pay the massive restitution ordered by the court. He was officially, irrevocably bankrupt. Back in the city, the 12th precinct underwent a massive, painful transformation. Chief Voss used Holt's spectacular downfall as the ultimate leverage. The union, terrified of federal intervention, backed down from their aggressive posturing. Bad cops were forced into early retirement. Toxic sergeants were demoted. The department instituted mandatory, rigorous de-escalation training and strictly enforced body camera compliance. The culture of silence had been shattered by the deafening echo of a steel-toed boot in a quiet courtroom. Years later, when Braden Holt was finally released from federal custody, he walked out of the prison gates a broken, aging man with a felony record, no money, and no prospects. He found a job working the overnight shift at a salvage yard away from the city he used to terrorize. He spent his nights sitting in a small, drafty toll booth, watching rusted cars get crushed into cubes of scrap metal. He had once believed he was untouchable, a king of the concrete jungle. Now he was just another ghost in the machine, forced to live out the rest of his days intimately, painfully aware of his place. Power, when decoupled from empathy and accountability, inevitably becomes the architect of its own destruction. Braden Holt's story is a stark reminder that arrogance is a fragile armor, easily shattered by the very justice it seeks to subvert. His fatal miscalculation wasn't just kicking the wrong woman. It was believing that his badge elevated him above the basic laws of human decency. Karma is rarely instantaneous, but when it arrives, it demands a heavy toll. Chief Kendra Voss didn't just strip him of his freedom. She dismantled the toxic ecosystem that allowed him to thrive. In the end, Holt's demand for absolute submission became his own prison sentence, proving that true authority is earned through respect, while tyranny only guarantees a spectacular, humiliating downfall.